double service. It's the keynote from our workshop, but also a special lecture by our distinguished Brackenridge visiting professor, Chris Janaway. I want to straight away note how grateful we are to the George W. Brackenridge Foundation for providing us with pots and pots of money that makes this possible, and also to the Department of Philosophy and Classics, which provides no money for anything because we don't have any, but it provides all sorts of willing guests, victims, and helpers. And also, actually, I want to call out Colin and Judith again, who through no fault of their own, have been responsible for large fractions of the organisation of this. So Chris Janaway is a professor of philosophy at the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom, and a former professor of philosophy from Birkbeck College in the University of London. He's written extensively on German philosophy from the 19th century, most particularly Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche. But he's also written on Plato, and I just discovered was classically trained in the first instance. So has written knowledgeably on Plato, we can say. And amongst his many books include Self and World in Schopenhauer's Philosophy from 1989, which was a real game changer in terms of Schopenhauer reception in the English-speaking world, with Schopenhauer on the philosophical map in the English-speaking world in a way that he had not been before. He's written and edited several other volumes, and I would just like to call one of those out, which is Beyond Selflessness, a reading of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, which is a fantastic book. Nietzsche's Genealogy is a fantastic book, very difficult to read, and Christopher Janaway's introduction to it, Beyond Selflessness, is really a masterpiece of interpretation that makes the thing very clear. Tonight he's going to be delivering a paper entitled Schopenhauer and the Value of Love, in which he promises, according to his abstract, to talk about Schopenhauer, Wagner, and sex.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you, Alistair. I would just like to also, I'm very grateful, very honoured to be invited to be the Brackenridge Distinguished Visiting Professor. Get that in the right order. And grateful to the Foundation, of course, for the funding. And I'd really like to thank everyone here. It's been a very hospitable occasion and a very good workshop, so thank you very much indeed. This paper was written for another occasion. A few weeks ago in Belgium there was a conference on Schopenhauer with a very specific remit. The title of the conference was Schopenhauer on Love and Compassion. And so I ventured into this topic because of that conference. Otherwise I might not have had a go at it, but I talk about love, two kinds of love in Schopenhauer, but also some much wider themes, I think, about the human predicament that this fits in with, in my view. So there is a handout. I hope there's enough copies of it. Everything that's on there will also be on the screen, so it's just a dual duplication so that you don't have to write down what's on the screen, you can just look at it and take it away. Okay, Schopenhauer and the Value of Love. Well, my first section has this title, Individuation, Disturbing Diagnosis and Redemptive Remedy. In Schopenhauer's radical view of the human condition, by which I mean the condition of the human individual, what is most troubling is the individual's very individuality. We exist and have cognition or knowledge as individuals, and from our own subjective point of view, we must inhabit a world in which we appear as separate from all others, indeed separate from all other existent things. But from the point of view of the world, Schopenhauer says, individuality is an illusion, and it's the wrong place to seek any true value. Schopenhauer sees individuality itself as a kind of transgression, the individual as something fallen or mistaken or broken away from the primal, I was careful, we had a talk this morning on this, from the primal unity. So he says things, rather extreme things like this. Every individuality is really only a special error, a false step, something it would be better should not be. In fact, something from which it's the real purpose of life to bring us back. Talking about death, in the second volume of his main work, death is the great opportunity no longer to be I. And he said we could say to someone who is dying, consolingly, you're ceasing to be something which you would have done better never to become. And that raises some interesting questions about whether it's better for you, would have been better for you not to have existed. I won't go into that right now. So what is this primordial unity that I've mentioned? Well, the answer, of course, is well known. The world, the reality that lies behind this alleged error of individuation is the will, in Schopenhauer's terms. Ignoring any more sophisticated distinctions we might make, we can state simply that for Schopenhauer, the will is the world as thing in itself. One of the many things that has puzzled commentators about this is as follows. Why does Schopenhauer say that the purpose of life here is to bring us back from the error of individuality precisely to a reabsorption of some kind into this world will? The world will is something dreadful. Schopenhauer has painted it as a blind, rapacious, cannibalistic striving without end or point, and as the ultimate source of all the horrors and miseries of life. Now he tells me I'd be better off being reabsorbed into this primordial monstrosity. I'd be better off being it, or not regarding myself as distinct from it, or something, rather than being this individual that I am. How, we wonder, could that be something to recommend? I'm not really going to fully resolve that perplexity, I think, but I think it's symptomatic of something, and that's what I want to talk about. So, Schopenhauer's philosophy makes two distinct uses, I think, of a contrast between the primordial world whole and the individual. Both uses are intended to reveal to the human individual that his or her individuality is neither metaphysically basic nor of final value. But the two uses have quite distinct strategic functions. And I'm going to call them the disturbing diagnosis and the redemptive remedy. And if you're at all familiar with Schopenhauer, what I'm trying to do here is, instead of thinking of Schopenhauer as constructing a single metaphysical system, which is what he's trying to do, think of him more as engaged in a rather complex exercise of persuasion. What's he trying to persuade us of? And I think there's, at least in my way of looking at it, two halves to this. One is a diagnosis and one is a remedy. So the message of the disturbing diagnosis in rough form is, well, you are not what you think you are. In one of his many passages, Schopenhauer compares the individual to a weak little vessel afloat in a boundless sea. Have I got that on here? Yeah, this famous passage, just as a sailor or a captain, boatman, sits in a boat, trusting the weak little vessel as the raging boundless sea raises up and casts down howling cliffs of waves. So the human individual sits calmly in a world full of sorrow, supported by and trusting in the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation, the principle that separates one bit of reality from another. His vanishing little person, his unextended present, his momentary comfort, these alone have reality for him. So you, the individual, place your trust in this vanishing little person. You make it the centre of value. You think of it as the locus of something you call happiness, as if attaining the ends of this particular part of the world, this human being, were of some consequence. But you're really, he's going to tell you, you're really at the mercy of an overpowering natural force, the will, of which you're but one tiny manifestation. This makes you an instrument or plaything of nature at large. That you have desires and needs is not of your choosing. This goes back to what Bernard Register was saying this afternoon. That you have desires at all and needs is not of your choosing. What you desire is determined by factors you cannot alter. And finally, that you fail to satisfy your persistent willing is guaranteed by your essence, which is identical with that of the world whole, of which you are an expression. Schopenhauer suggests that the merest inkling that this faith in our separateness from all else is misplaced, the merest inkling that something fishy about individuation induces what he calls a dread, German word grausen, in the ordinary human being. Hence, he must expect that his message here to be disturbing. He was trying to displace our sense of individuality being something secure and important. As I say, rather a radical view, I think. On the other hand, consider the remedy that he offers for this condition. Short of dying, the individual can live through another kind of extinction by way of a radical change in consciousness. Provided we lose our trust in this vanishing little person and renounce all aspiration to happiness through fulfilling desires directed towards the individual. Schopenhauer holds that for someone in this transformed state, the sense of self alters, all egoistic motivation ceases, and they detach themselves from valuing the individual human being or person. He uses the person to refer to the human being. Detach themselves from valuing the individual human being or person they happen to be, to such an extent that what impinges positively or negatively on this person matters no more than what impinges on any other. Schopenhauer calls this the self-negation or self-abolition of the will in the individual. We might also call it the extinction of the individual self in consciousness. In this state, he thinks, I would continue to be a centre of experience, but I would regard myself as a pure subject of cognition, conscious of the world and of itself, but without identifying this self with any spatio-temporal thing. So I wouldn't identify the self I'm aware of being with this particular human being. In such a transformation in consciousness, it's such a transformation in consciousness that Schopenhauer locates the only true path to what he calls salvation. So the remedy that redeems the human condition is loss of attachment to the individual and the satisfaction of its desires. So my question in this paper is, where does love belong in this picture? Love, one might think, is a consolation for an otherwise solitary existence, a triumph over separateness, or at least a yearning to overcome it, a hope that we're not merely stranded each in our own ego-centered isolation. As Plato's character Aristophanes put it long ago in the Symposium, love is the name for our pursuit of wholeness, for our desire to be complete. Everyone in love would want to, as the character says, melt together with the one he loves so that one person emerged from two. Plato's word for love is eros. But for Schopenhauer, this erotic love will not work as an amelioration of the individual's predicament. As we shall see, a love like this, that singles out one other individual as the object of desire, solves nothing for me, the desiring individual. It's merely a trick of nature, an exploitation of my individuality for a larger purpose. There is a kind of love that can indeed convey someone along the path towards that redemptive extinction of individual self in consciousness. But such love is quite distinct from eros, because it singles out no particular object of desire and allegedly detaches him or her from desire altogether. Schopenhauer aligns this other form of love with the Christian concepts of agape and caritas. So I want to just, as briefly as I can, discuss these two kinds of love that Schopenhauer distinguishes, and ask what he has to say about their value. What, if anything, makes them a good thing. So, and I want to suggest there's a contrast, quite a stark contrast between the two. The kind of love that appears to be of value to the individual human being by satisfying his or her desires is unmasked by Schopenhauer as part of his disturbing diagnosis, as valueless to the individual. But there's a selfless kind of love, which is part of his redemptive remedy, in that it prompts the extinction of the individual self in consciousness. So this selfish, desirous love is of no worth to the individual self, but selfless love, perhaps paradoxically, is something devoutly to be wished for oneself. So, just a little note on terminology. The two words we're going to be using, Geschlechtsliebe and Menschenliebe, which I will now explain. So, Liebe is the German word for love. So, it looks like these two concepts, Menschenliebe and Geschlechtsliebe, are two forms of love. When he first wrote The World as Will and Representation in 1818, Schopenhauer spoke of love in the context of Christian ethics. It's not the only place he mentioned it, but he certainly does. In Christian ethics, he wrote, Christian ethics lead to the highest degree of love. But then in the final edition of the book that he revised in 1859, the phrase, the highest degree of love, is altered to the highest degree of Menschenliebe, a particular form of love. And that was also the term he used in his essay on the basis of morals in 1841. It's hard to translate this word Menschenliebe well into English, I think. A literal equivalent would be philanthropy, or Anglo-Greek equivalent of the German would be philanthropy, but this word has, to me, too much of a connotation of charitable works, and is less clearly a species of love. You could translate it as human love, or love of humanity, but those are not very elegant in English. So I've settled on loving kindness, which is the way the word has also sometimes been translated by other people. Some reluctance, because loving kindness doesn't really bring out that it is a form of love. It is a form of Liebe, which I'm going to call it loving kindness. And this is the kind of love that Schopenhauer links with the Latin caritas and the Greek agape, the Christian notions. And sometimes he carries on using the word Liebe for love, just love, interchangeably with Menschenliebe. He talks about pure love or unselfish love, synonymously, I think, with Menschenliebe. Okay, the other term that he uses, Geschlechtsliebe, is much more easily translated as sexual love. And here we should think not just of a simple desire for sexual activity or gratification. The phenomenon is really being in love, I think, that he's talking about. So he says the best examples are in fiction, Romeo and Juliet, Goethe's novella Werther, Die Leidenschaft von Werther. These kind of examples are what he means by this. A kind of being in love, specifically between man and woman. This state, he says, is rooted in the sex drive, Geschlechtstrieb, but it's much more specific than that. It occurs when the sex drive, he says, is more closely determined, specialized, and individualized. Mere sex drive is base and ignoble, because it's directed at all without individualization. By contrast, the phenomenon that concerns Schopenhauer here is the sex drive strongly and persistently individualized, addressed to a single personal. What's happened? I didn't do anything. I don't know what it's giving me some time here. I don't know what happened. Maybe it's the wire.
Come back.
Something's come back.
Yeah, analog backup.
Okay, so he makes a distinction between the sex drive, which exists in all living beings, I think, and this Geschlechtsliebe, this being in love, where he says that It's the sex drive strongly and persistently individualized, addressed to a single personal love object, and intensified into an excessive passion. He says, individualization, this is not on the handout, individualization and with it the intensity of being in love can reach so high a degree that without their satisfaction, all the good things of the world and even life itself lose their value. So it's a really intense state of mind that he's talking about. One way of putting this is that in the consciousness of one human individual, another human individual can become such an exaggeratedly important and irreplaceable object of desire that other objects of desire, including even being alive, are no longer recognized as having value for the individual. Okay, so the next section is the value of sexual love. So my question here is, what, in Schopenhauer's view, is the good of this Geschlechtsliebe, sexual love? Well, part of its good is that it leads or tends to lead to procreation of further human individuals, which is at least a relative good, or good for the human species. Not really particularly good for the individuals, actually. But he does say, you know, if we really understood what life is, we would think it would be better not to have been born. So, but clearly the mere indiscriminate exercise of the sexual drive would accomplish that, right? It would accomplish procreation. Many circumstances, anyway. Geschlechtsliebe is a more refined form of good from Schopenhauer's eyes. It has a remarkable selectivity of focus. It trains extreme desire and minute attentiveness exclusively upon a certain individual. And in his view, this serves the end of producing better human specimens in the succeeding generation. He has the belief, which he explains in great detail, which I'm not going to go into, that we're most powerfully attracted to the one with whom we can produce fitter offspring. And yet, for the individual who feels this passion of Geschlechtsliebe, or indeed even for the recipient of such passion, there's no direct value at all. They are used as instruments by what Schopenhauer calls the will of the species. The will of the species succeeds by deluding the individual into the belief that he or she stands to gain something of value from the whole exercise. In happier cases, if that's the right word to use for Schopenhauer, if it ever is, the individual at least attains relief of sheer sexual appetite. But that again is something common to any exercise of the sexual drive and not specific to being in love. More importantly, being in love doesn't, in Schopenhauer's view, deliver the bliss of high personal fulfillment it appears to promise. One might go on to form a successful and rewarding relationship with the object of one's desire because you share likes and dislikes, so you appreciate their intellect and so on and so on. But those are not goods that arise from being in love as such. Being in love brings no peculiar value of its own to the individual lover. It is only good because of its benefit to the unborn offspring likely to result from its consummation. So Schopenhauer has this view that naturally human beings are motivated egoistically. Egoism is what he says by nature boundless. The human being unconditionally wills to preserve his existence, wields every pleasure of which he's capable, even seeks where possible to develop new capacities for pleasure. In line with this, each one makes himself the midpoint of the world. So we are all egoistic, and the species, this teleology of the species to produce better offspring, uses our egoism by deluding us into thinking we're going to gain something personally from the attaining the object of our desire in love. So Geschlechtsliebe relies on the human being retaining the natural, unreformed consciousness characteristic of individuals, right? This thing about we place all the value in attaining the desires of this individual human being. It relies on our retaining that outlook, but it does so only in the service of a value that bypasses the individual entirely, and that's the quotes under this section we've got on the handout. In order to rouse the activity of the individual being, egoistic ends are the only ones on which we can count with certainty. Nature can attain her end only by implanting in the individual a certain delusion, which is what is Wagner in German. And by virtue of this, that which in truth is merely a good thing for the species seems to him to be a good thing for himself, or herself, I should say. Therefore, again, another passage, therefore what guides the human being here is really an instinct directed to what is best for the species, whereas the human being himself is under the delusion that he's seeking merely a heightening of his own pleasure. So, on the one hand, in the consciousness of the individual thinks he or she is gaining something of individual value, but actually that's not going to be the case. The only value is for the species. And it seems to me this use of the notion of something greater than the individual, the will here, is part of what I call Schopenhauer's disturbing diagnosis. Though you continue to believe you pursue a goal uniquely valuable to yourself, a larger will that permeates nature is using you, the individual, for ends which are not your own. Okay, so now's a bit on Wagner. I have a lovely picture of the what you might call a production still from the first performance of Tristan and Isolde, which is actually quite funny. Extremely burly, big beard. Not really what we would think of, you know, breastplate. And not. Anyway, you've seen it. So, a pair of lovers, we might well add to Schopenhauer's fictional examples, you know, Romeo and Juliet and the other things. We could add Tristan and Isolde. They're all the more appropriate here because the presentation of their story in Wagner's opera of the same name was directly inspired by the composer's enthusiastic and dedicated reading of Schopenhauer. Wagner began reading Schopenhauer in 1854, while Schopenhauer was still alive. In his letters to Mathilde Wesendonck during 1858-9, Wagner makes many warm references to Schopenhauer, who he calls my friend Schopenhauer, though actually he's never met him. And he reports how he's rereading the philosopher as he works to complete the opera Tristan and Isolde. In the finished product, Wagner envelops the love narrative in heavy layers of Schopenhauerian metaphysical symbolism. So is this the first great Schopenhauerian love story, or perhaps the last? Will it help us to build a positive, redeeming account of love from Schopenhauerian materials? Wagner thought so. I'm just going to give you a few. This is a bit cheap in a way because without the music, Wagner is a very questionable thing. But I'm just giving you a few of the words that he writes for Tristan and Isolde to sing to one another in Act 2, Scene 2 of this opera. And then I'm going to discuss the influence of Schopenhauer on this. So they sing, "Oh, sink down upon us, night of love, make me forget I live. Free me from the world. Holy twilight's glorious presentiment obliterates the horror of delusion," Wahn, same word, "setting us free from the world." The opposition of day and night is used as a multi-layered metaphor throughout this scene. At one level, day is the public world where Tristan and Isolde have their well-defined social roles. In that world, their love is forbidden and treacherous. Night is a retreat into an intimate space where their social roles can be abandoned. But metaphysics is also at play here. Day is a world of Schein in German, brightness or false appearance, and of Wahn, the same word, delusion. Night, by contrast, is a condition that removes the false appearance, and, this is the really Schopenhauerian part, I think, night is a condition that removes the false appearance and reveals the lovers not as two distinct individuals, but as one, at least potentially one. Their barely coherent utterances strive to express this revelation in various terms, like, I'm not distinct from you, I am you, you are me, I am the world, and so on. So I'll give you a little flavour of that. Again, without the music it's kind of crazy, but the words they're actually singing, I myself am the world, supreme bliss of being, life of holiest loving, never more to awaken, delusion-free, sweetly known desire. You, Tristan, I, Isolde, no more Tristan, sings Tristan. You Isolde, I Tristan, no more Isolde, sings Isolde. Ever unendingly one consciousness, supreme joy of love growing in our breast. And this is the famous central scene where their love is consummated, at least in some form or other. So Tristan and Isolde undergo a radical, violent shift in consciousness, one that puts their own existence as individuals in question. Their desire is to abandon all separation of self from self, or self from non-self, to lose individuality in a state of bliss. So they're singing a Schopenhauerian text to an extent. But, as has often been pointed out, if this were intended as a transposition of Schopenhauer's theory of love into music, it would be a misunderstanding. In Schopenhauer's view, loss of a sense of individual self is indeed redemptive. Right? Losing your sense of individual self is redemptive. But such redemption presupposes loss of desire, and certainly loss of sexual desire, which is the most vehement and burdensome expression of will in Schopenhauer's view. The idea of redemption from willing through the experience of this most powerful and pernicious form of willing seems absurd, unless it's a kind of cure by aversion. That's not what Wagner has in mind. So Mark Johnston, for example, writes bluntly of the mistake in Tristan and Isolde, saying quite rightly that Schopenhauer would have found no place for agape, this selfless kind of love, in the context of erotic love. Okay, well, however, Wagner didn't simply make a mistake. Rather, he was deliberately set on rectifying what he saw as a gap in Schopenhauer's philosophy. And he explained this in a letter he wrote lots of letters to Matilda Wesendonck during this period, 1859. This is on the handout. He says, recently I've slowly read through Friend Schopenhauer, never met him. Recently I've slowly read through Friend Schopenhauer's chief work once again. This time it's stimulated enormously to an expansion and in some particulars a correction of his system. The subject's uncommonly important, and he says, it's only I that could have done it. It goes on a bit longer. Okay, showing the path of salvation that leads to the total quietening of the will through love. And moreover, not through an abstract Menschenliebe, but through a love that really germinates out of the ground of Geschlechtsliebe, i.e. the attraction between man and woman. What's decisive is that to this end I can use, as philosopher, the material of the concept that Schopenhauer himself gives me. So, I think the next bit is the really crucial bit that I'll come back to. I managed to show, says Wagner, with the greatest sureness, the possibility of attaining in love that elevation above the individual drive of the will, where after the total consequence of the latter, the will of the species comes to full consciousness of itself, which at this high level is necessarily synonymous with total quietening. And this will fill the lacunas, the gaps in Schopenhauer's system completely and satisfying. In fact, I don't know if not everyone perhaps knows this, but Wagner actually wrote a letter to Schopenhauer in 1859, 2 years before Schopenhauer died. He never actually sent it, but the draft exists. The draft of the letter, he said things like this, and it's a little extract from it. I would like to flatter myself. Oh, yes. He would like to flatter himself. I would like to flatter myself by telling you about a view of my own, according to which the natural tendency to sexual love represents a way to salvation, to self-knowledge, and to self-negation. Well, all these are Schopenhauer's terms, but Schopenhauer doesn't think you can get to this state of salvation through sexual love, specifically not. Then he acknowledges, he says, you alone give me the conceptual resources through which it becomes possible to communicate my opinion philosophically. The letter was never sent, as I said. Had he ever received it, we know Schopenhauer wouldn't have been impressed. But you might think Wagner had a point in some way. Schopenhauer describes the lover's state, this is still the sexual lover, as always the one who's in love. Schopenhauer describes the lover's state differently from that of the ordinary human individual, who trusts in his own small, vanishing person as the centre of value. The lover's outlook is transformed. so that nothing ordinarily desired in life appears to have any worth unless the love object is attained, the other individual is attained. But is this transfigured outlook wholly illusory? Does anything ordinarily desired in life really have value for the individual? In Schopenhauer's view, it doesn't. Happiness is always an illusion. Nothing attained by efforts of individual willing is ever of true worth. The life of every individual subject in whom the will is alive is tormented and ultimately void. I use the word nichtig, worthless, vain, empty, nothing, nothingy. Can't say that. Nothing. So, while the lover's heightened passion indeed promotes the delusion that one particular object of desire is of value, it's at least correct in revealing the emptiness of everything else, the worthlessness of the bright but deceptive day that Isolde and Tristan and Isolde flee from. Might there not be in this the seed of a redemption from the life of willing and suffering, as Schopenhauer puts it? In other words, might the opportunity to merge completely with another individual not seem to be that release from being I that Schopenhauer talked about? That return from a worthless existence as that which we would have been better never to become. That's surely how Wagner reads the situation. That he should have done so seems predictable, according to a view put forward by Michael Tanner, who, writing about Wagner, says Wagner was a Schopenhauerian from the start, that is, before he ever read Schopenhauer. In what sense? Well, Michael Tanner writes, Schopenhauer claims that being itself, is the original sin. That Wagner always held a position which amounts to that comes out in the fact that the redeemers in his works long to redeem just as much as the sinners long to be redeemed. And Tanner is actually, I think, echoing one of Nietzsche's comments about Wagner. In the case of Wagner, Wagner says, his operas are the operas of redemption. One of the shorter things Nietzsche says about Wagner. If Wagner and his characters are constitutionally redemption-hungry, as it were, then they'll be liable to look for redemption in places where, from Schopenhauer's point of view, it's just not to be found. However, to see why Wagner is misusing the conceptual resources Schopenhauer provides, let's examine more closely what he's done here. So the key passage from the letter, the first letter to Matilda Wesendorf, is the bit, I had this nicely highlighted on my next slide, is the last part. I managed to show with the greatest sureness the possibility of attaining in love that elevation above the individual driving of the will, where after the total conquest of the life of the will of the species comes to full consciousness of itself, which at this high level is necessarily synonymous with quietening. Wagner talks about quietening, Beruhigung is his word, presumably thinking that once the lover's consciousness is disabused of the illusion that his or her individuality is basic, his or her consciousness would become blissfully released from the neediness and striving that attaches to individuality. But this is to confuse Schopenhauer's disturbing diagnosis with his redemptive remedy. In Schopenhauer, the will of the species is the organism's instinctive drive towards procreation of the best possible offspring. If that will were to become conscious of itself, the illusion involved in being in love would fall away. Instead of idealizing the love object as something or someone unique and special, the individual would glimpse the unsavory truth that he or she is just the plaything of an impersonal biological species impulse. This, we might well imagine, would shatter the sense of being in love and potentially demotivate the individual to such an extent that the will of the species wouldn't be fulfilled at all. And actually, Schopenhauer thinks that once the will of the species has been fulfilled, the illusion lapses anyway. I think this is on the page. Yeah, fairly famous, rather Schopenhauer is very good at being rather bluntly frank about things. So he says, and this may be a personal infection by whatever. So everyone who is in love will experience an extraordinary disillusionment after the pleasure he finally attains. He will be astonished that what was desired with such longing achieves nothing more than what every other sexual satisfaction achieves. So he doesn't see himself benefited by it. The delusion by means of which the individual was the dupe of the species has disappeared. So if the will of the species became conscious of what's happening when we're in love, it would kind of destroy the whole illusion. And it's really, in Schopenhauerian terms, what Wagner is attempting to do doesn't work. When the delusion of individual autonomy, attainment of egoistic ends is dissolved, the psychological effect is deflation rather than elevation, frustration rather than quiet. For Schopenhauer, elevation and peace can come only to one who no longer fixes on a single individual object of desire, and in fact no longer desires anything at all specifically for him or herself. Wagner, incidentally, later managed to fall in line with this when he wrote Parsifal, his last opera. In the central scene of that work, the character Parsifal is redeemed precisely at the point where the sexual attraction between man and woman exerts its pull on him and he recoils from it. That is truly Schopenhauer, I think. Okay, so that was a bit about Wagner. I mean, this exemplar of a Schopenhauerian kind of love doesn't really work. It's not really Schopenhauerian. So now to this other form of love, Menschenliebe, which I call loving kindness. What is the good of that, this pure love that Schopenhauer sometimes calls it? Well, Menschenliebe is one of the two basic moral virtues for Schopenhauer, the other being justice. Both of these moral virtues, all the other moral virtues stem from Menschenliebe, or justice, and they have a single origin in the human incentive that he calls Mitleid, or compassion. Compassion is the disposition to will the well-being of another individual, pure and simple. And an action has moral worth if and only if it stems from this disposition. Menschenliebe is a way that compassion expresses itself. And if one is in that state, he says, I shall be moved by that purely moral motive to make a greater or lesser sacrifice for the other's need or distress. The sacrifice that can consist in the exertion of my bodily or mental powers for him, in my property, in my health, freedom, and even in my life. So, aiming at any reward for oneself, either in this life or a supposed future existence, blights one's chances of acting morally. Because to act morally, one must act solely for the benefit of the other. And as a little example, it says, if someone who is giving alms, who is giving charity out to someone, were to ask me what he gets out of doing so, my conscientious answer would be, just that poor man's fate has been alleviated by so much. But apart from that, nothing at all. If that's no use to you, and it really doesn't matter to you, then you didn't really want to give alms, but rather to make a purchase. You wanted to gain something out of it. Then you've been swindled out of your money. But if it did matter to you that that man who is oppressed by want should suffer less, then you have indeed achieved your end. And you get out of it the fact that he suffers less. And you see precisely how much your gift rewards itself. So Menschenliebe, this kind of love, or loving kindness, as I call it, is unlike Geschlechtsliebe in at least two ways. Most obviously, it's entirely unegoistic in its motivation, directing desire towards another individual only for the sake of that individual's well-being. That's the idea. And implicitly, I think, it's impartial as to whose well-being it wills. In this example, that poor man whom you're giving money to is singled out from others not by any preferential attitude, delusory or otherwise, towards his peculiar qualities, but rather he's just by his suffering pure and simple. That is what motivates. any human being in the same circumstances would be shown the same loving concern by someone motivated by mitleid, compassion, as indeed would any animal. This gets back to what Sandy was saying this afternoon, as indeed would any animal who was suffering in its own way. Not from lack of money, but from lack of something else. So in this passage it appears that the good of Menschenliebe, this virtue, is located simply in its tendency to diminish suffering. But in fact, Schopenhauer's understanding of the value of Menschenliebe, this moral virtue of human loving kindness, is more complicated than that. And I'm going to now refer to another letter, this time a letter from Schopenhauer, 1844. Big extract from this handout. He corresponded a lot with this Johann Albrecht Becker, who was actually a jurist, a prominent lawyer in Mainz. Was actually rather a good philosophical correspondent. And in a letter he asked Schopenhauer, for whom does the incentive that you call uniquely moral have particular value? And in his reply, Schopenhauer writes, makes some rather interesting, perhaps rather surprising remarks about the connection between morality and this further state that he calls negation of the will to life. So here's a passage. This is not, and to my mind, not translated anywhere else. Maybe this is my translation from the letters. So Schopenhauer writes to Becker, you ask, for whom moral actions have value? Answer, for him that performs them. Let's think about that. Hence, his satisfaction with himself and the approval of impartial witnesses. And two, in comparison with what? Well, with all of his other actions that arise from the other two incentives, which are egoism and malice. And now, as to what this value of moral action ultimately rests on, the value that such actions, that's moral actions, the value that such actions have for the one who performs them himself is a transcendent value, inasmuch as it lies in their leading him towards the sole path of salvation, i.e., deliverance from this world of being born, suffering, and dying. More particularly, the way in which they achieve this, he says, is described in the world as the world of representation. We can say a little bit about that in a minute. This contains a really final elucidation concerning the value of morality, which value is not itself something absolutely final, but rather a step towards it. With his idea of a transcendent value for moral actions, Schopenhauer is saying that my acting out of loving kindness ultimately has worth only because it takes me a step nearer to a self-negation on the part of the will that manifests itself in me, and an abandonment in my consciousness of identification with the individual human being. My acting compassionately has value principally for me. There is, strikingly, no mention here of any value my loving, compassionate action might have for the one whose suffering is relieved or prevented by my action. No mention of any value in the outcome of suffering simply being relieved or prevented as such, or of well-beings being preserved. And the value that acting compassionately has for me is only that of leading towards something else, leading towards this resignation and negation of the will to life. And it's this latter state whose value would be what he calls an absolute letztes, something absolutely final. Thus it seems that the value attributed here to morality, the value for the agent of performing moral actions, is a kind of instrumental value, a value it holds because of its relation to a further valuable end. Now, where's Bernard? Bernard Rosister, in actually a review of my book on Nietzsche, pointed out a distinction between two kinds of selflessness, which he contrasts, I think, quite rightly. So there's a contrast between the selflessness of the compassionate individual, on the one hand, and on the other, the selflessness achieved through ascetic resignation, this idea of being completely willless, that Bernard indeed talked about this afternoon. And we can agree that these two states, that of the compassionate moral agent and that of the resigned subject in whom will to life is negated, are conceptually distinct. That seems right. But from this letter we see that in value they're closely linked for Schopenhauer. The former's the value of being a compassionate agent, of that kind of selflessness, resides solely, it seems, in its relation to the selflessness of negation of the will. And in The World as Will and Representation, the passages that Schopenhauer refers to in his letter to Becker, we see that he thinks that the moral virtues are a sign or symptom of the dawning of this knowledge that undoes the distinction between individuals, the delusion of individuation. He says the will already flaps its wings in order to fly away from the delusion of individuation. Acting morally acquaints the agent with a non-egoistic outlook upon the world, which dimly intimates this other state that has final value. Secondly, acting morally facilitates or causally produces the state of will-less resignation. Schopenhauer says that the virtues, including Menschenliebe, are a means of advancing self-denial and consequently negation of the will to life. The moral virtues, Schopenhauer says again, are not really the ultimate end, but only a step towards it. Well, Schopenhauer speaks of means and ends here, hence the interpretation that performing moral actions is being assigned an instrumental value. That might be misleading unless we think separately of ends and values here. Schopenhauer doesn't construe the compassionate moral agent, the person who's selflessly giving money to someone in need. Schopenhauer doesn't construe that agent as regarding the other's suffering or his own reaction to it instrumentally. It's not that I act out of compassion in order to facilitate the will's ultimate self-denial in myself. My motivation is, if the action is to be morally good, must be nothing but the removal of the other's suffering. Schopenhauer needn't deny that there's some value in that suffering being removed, but merely insists that the only final value attainable is the will's self-negation. Elsewhere, he comments that we should regard the complete self-abolition and negation of the will, the true absence of will, will-lessness, as the one radical cure for the disease against which all other goods, such as fulfilled wishes and achieved happiness, are only palliatives or anodynes. So there are other goods. Among them, someone's fulfilling their desire not to be in pain, or I fulfilling my desire to help them not be in pain. Compassionate action can be a good. Removal of the other's pain can be a good. But beyond that, they have a transcendent value because they constitute a step towards the self-abolition of the will. And that's the state in which the sole final value resides. So this, I think, is the place of Menschenliebe in what I call Schopenhauer's redemptive remedy for the human condition. Menschenliebe intimates and facilitates the extinction of the individual self in consciousness, helping to reveal to us the greater whole to which we can return from individuation's false step or error that we started with. I've got a little bit to go here. I'll just pause at this moment, partly because my throat's a bit funny. In this last section, when I delivered this paper in Belgium, somebody accused me of doing a lot of analytical philosophy in this last bit. Oh no. Or compliment. So I'm glad you thought that was analytical philosophy. So I'm just pausing a bit here, because this is a little... So I'm going to raise a problem now for Schopenhauer, and that is, how can negation of the will? So this idea that I lose the will, I lose any desires in my consciousness. I'm still aware of being, I'm something or other, I'm a pure subject of experience, but I'm not aware of any desires. I don't attach myself to desiring any objects in the world, and that's salvation, he says. So, well, Given Schopenhauer's insistence that negation of the will is the sole state that has final value, and given that he contrasts it with other goods, what if we ask him, well, is that state of negation of the will good? We would expect that he's going to answer yes, right? The state of final value contrasted with other goods, it must itself be good. But when it comes to the question of whether negation of the will is the highest good, he says no, or at best, yes, but only figuratively. And here's the relevant passage, which again was alluded to earlier today. This is the last sort of major bit, really, that I'm going to talk about. So Schopenhauer insists that absolute good is a contradiction. Highest good, or summum bonum, mean the same thing, denoting properly an ultimate satisfaction for the will, following which there will be no new willing. But such a thing is unthinkable. There's no highest good, no absolute good for the will, but rather only ever a temporary good. But if we'd like to retain an old expression out of habit, giving it an honorary or emeritus status, as it were, we might figuratively call the complete abolition and negation of the will the true absence of the will, the only thing that can give everlasting contentment, the only thing that can redeem the world. We might call this the absolute good, the summum bonum. Now again, I'm going to refer to Bernard Regenster on this. He finds in this passage a curious ambivalence on Schopenhauer's part. Bernard writes, this is in the companion to Schopenhauer, published last year. Although it's the best condition available to human beings, complete resignation remains for him, Schopenhauer, a distant second best to the fulfillment we've been hoping for, merely an ersatz happiness. But I suggest there isn't this ambivalence here. I suggest Schopenhauer's ambivalence is about the expression highest good. It's the expression highest good that is now emeritus and no longer at work. The reason is that the very term good can be used only figuratively in the present context. Schopenhauer defines the good such that its essence is to exist only in relation to a desiring will. But for someone in the state of will-lessness, there's no desiring will to stand in relation to. So nothing can literally be good for them. It seems to me there's no ambivalence about the value of will-lessness here for Schopenhauer, but there's a conceptual straitjacket that threatens incoherence. If your will is absent, nothing can be good for you. But your will's being absent is the state that has final value. Therefore, being in the state that has final value cannot be good for you. Schopenhauer's perfectly understandable ambivalence, it seems to me, is conceptual here. He hesitates to assert this last absurd-seeming thing. The state that has final value is not good. I mean, to get out of that, the two options would be to withdraw his definition of good, thinking it's a will, or to deny this final value to the negation of the will. But both of those would be ruinous to his whole project. So he sidesteps the dilemma by saying that, in a way, the negation of the will is a good state. But it can't literally be described as good, since the expression good has retired from the scene once a state of will-lessness has been attained. We can put the same point slightly differently. Will-lessness cannot literally be said to be a good from the point of view of the will-less, pure subject of knowledge and subject of cognition. But from the point of view of the unreformed willing subject who places trust in the individual person and the satisfaction of its desires, will-lessness is literally a desirable state, and hence a good, by Schopenhauer's lights. It must be so, for if acting morally is of value to the individual willing agent, because it leads him towards this finally valuable state of salvation, then that salvation can't be but of value also for the individual willing agent. Will-lessness is a literal good relative to us who remain willing beings. But to an utterly will-less subject, it could at best be figurative. Now, this way of putting it requires us to posit a will to be willless, I think, which is something Schopenhauer doesn't mention. This will to be willless would be absent in the willless subject, the final state, but present in us ordinary individuals. If something is a good only in relation to a desiring will for it, and if willlessness is a good for the ordinary willing being, then the ordinary willing being must have a desire for willlessness. This may seem paradoxical, but it might not be an insuperable problem as long as we're prepared to accept there's no contradiction in desiring to have no desires, which is what it amounts to. So just one final question. I realise I'm going a rather long time. If this will to willlessness concerns what I, the individual, desire for myself, isn't it going to be yet another egoistic desire? And as part of his reply to Becker, Schopenhauer effectively denies this. That's the last little quote. He says, under the concept of egoism, the pursuit and attainment of one's own eternal salvation is not to be subsumed, since it consists in the negation of the will to life, and along with that, precisely in the dissolution of one's own individuality. The value that moral actions have in this respect for the one who performs them doesn't make them egoistic. Okay, so to allow this negation of the will to be literally a good for the individual, we have to see it as satisfying one of the individual's desires. But if it turns out I can have desires directed towards what is good for me without those desires being egoistic, and if in particular the desire to have all my egoistic desires dissolved needn't itself be an egoistic desire, the result is that the state of willless resignation supposedly attained in this negation of the will can be a good for the individual, and can be so without trapping the individual in yet more egoism. That's the bit I think that was a bit complicated, and I'll talk about it. So, just a very brief conclusion. I've argued that Schopenhauer's accounts of Geschlechtsliebe, sexual love, Menschenliebe, loving kindness, both exploit his division between the individual and a greater whole into which he or she can be absorbed. But they exemplify two distinct strategies that shape his philosophy. The account of Geschlechtsliebe diagnoses it in a manner calculated to disturb our ingrained faith in the diminishing little person. It diagnoses it as a deluded state in which we're unwitting instruments of a greater will, and as a state that lacks any true value for ourselves. On the other hand, Menschenliebe, this moral loving kindness, plays a crucial role in the remedy Schopenhauer offers for the human condition. Acting out of Menschenliebe with the aim of enhancing the well-being of another for its own sake is a good for the individual who so acts, because it's instrumental towards the redemption that consists in the negation of the will. Acting in a way that's instrumental towards the negation of the will is also a good, the only final good, for the willing individual. It's thus only when we love others selflessly that love is genuinely good for ourselves. Thank you.
So I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you for this. This was very illuminating. I'm especially interested in what you call the transcendent value of Menschenliebe. And it's always been very puzzling to me how to get from compassion to resignation. And the text you suggest are, directly address the very question. But I'm still remain a little bit puzzled. What's supposed to bring about resignation is the fact that you come to realize that it's impossible, not just unlikely, but impossible for you to get everything that you want once and for all, which is fulfillment in terms of which he defines ordinary happiness. Right? But when you look at the actual arguments that he offers, the detailed arguments that he offers that are supposed to show this, that have to do with the way human human psychology works, the way human desire operates, and so on and so forth. It seems as though none of these arguments have to do with being able to see through the principle of individuation and, as he puts it, identifying your own lot with the lot of mankind in general. You just have to see, look, you find out how desire operates, and maybe you need to look about how it's happened in the case of other people as well. But you find out about this, you find out, and you realize, oh, geez, given the way the world is, and given the way I'm constituted as a human being, fulfillment is just radically, inescapably elusive.
Yeah. Well, I think then in that case, I think I'd rather disagree with you on how I think Schopenhauer thinks this state of resignation comes about. Actually, there's a passage that I didn't read out, so it's getting a bit short of time, but he writes this letter to Becker and says, look, I've explained it in The World as Will and Representation, and he points to two particular passages. So he says, the person who exhibits this mention lever, this loving kindness, he says, this person takes over all the sufferings that originally fall to the lot of others. He appropriates to himself the greater share of these than will come to him as an individual in the ordinary course of things. He now identifies his own lot with that of mankind in general. But this is a hard lot, namely that of striving, suffering, and dying. Therefore, whoever, by renouncing every accidental advantage, wills for himself no other lot than that of mankind in general, can no longer will even this for any length of time. Clinging to life and its pleasures must now soon yield and make way for a universal resignation. So, the idea seems to be that if you are a very virtuous human being, it's by being compassionate that you discover this. It's not by argument. Right? It's not by working out what the nature of desire is. I think that's the route, as it were, that you were pursuing, as it were. You come to a realization about the nature of desire that is never fulfillable, and that knowledge leads to resignation. It does say obviously knowledge, but it seems to me he's speaking of a much more sort of gut feeling kind of knowledge that you take it, whatever this means. You take on all the suffering of all others. You want your lot to be the lot of the whole of mankind. So you kind of experience all this huge amount of suffering, and it's too much for you. You're demotivated by the sheer amount of suffering. Right? There's so much suffering that you cannot do anything about it. And then, as I said, as a consequence, you get into the state where clinging to this idea that life, by pursuing will, can have any value, just gets eradicated. So it's not. I don't see that he thinks this state will come about by argument. Right. So maybe that's fine.
I agree. So, and I agree in saying it's right.
Right.
But I'm pointing to sort of a peculiarity of the practice itself. Right? It's time for us because the striving, suffering, and dying are. I can identify, see that there's a whole lot of striving, suffering, and dying, and this is just, I'm never going to be able to make much of a dent in it, and so on and so forth. But hey, maybe if we just keep at it, in the long haul, we might be able to make things better.
Yeah.
And in that case, I could be discouraged about my own personal prospects here and now, but I would just do my little part and in the hope that eventually. So what you need to understand is that there's something in the very, nature of human life, the nature of the world in which that life is lived, that makes it impossible even in the long haul. And it seems to me that's a different kind of insight than the insight that I'm one with everybody and that their suffering is my suffering and so on and so forth.
Right. Okay, I think it's important. But so what you just said is something he clearly thinks is true, and that philosophy can work this out by analysing the nature of desire, the nature of suffering, and happiness, and all the things that we're talking about suffering very, very well. So, as it were, as philosophers, we can gain an understanding of what desire is and what suffering is and where value lies and all of that. And but none of that, I think, will be itself a preparation for, well, none of that will trigger this state of resignation or negation of the will. And I think he thinks probably that, he's thinking of, saintly figures in the Christian tradition or the Hindu tradition or whatever, who are, as it were, struck by human suffering in a way that really alters it's a kind of conversion experience, I think he's talking about. And maybe philosophy can help explain why that's a better view of the world. Why seeing it the way the saint sees it is actually cognitively better, it's nearer the truth. But it doesn't mean that the saint has to arrive at that position by philosophical analysis of desiring, it seems to me. I mean, don't forget the other way of achieving this is by suffering. He says, you suffer so much that the will to life in you just, gives up.
Absolutely. You also conceive that reading his book.
Sorry, reading it?
Reading his book might do the trick.
if you suffer this.
So bad.
If you suffer.
But no, if you have to you have to appropriate the knowledge, and it talks about appropriation, you have to really make the knowledge a little fiction.
Yeah, of course. An important first stage in all this might be to clear away a whole lot of other philosophical doctrines about, the attainment of happiness and the purpose of life and all this kind of stuff. So maybe you'll be better prepared for this kind of experience by reading his book. But I still think, you can read his book as we've all done, and this amazing whatever it is kind of conversion doesn't happen. Otherwise I probably wouldn't be. I'd probably be in some monastery somewhere. Anyway, question here.
It sounds like he's embracing Taoism, which is that what we'll go.
So it sounds as if he's
embracing Taoism, which is that we'll go how to look at it. But what about the question of altruism inherently being selfish in of itself? Whereas giving a charitable act, you are placing that man's welfare over your personal value of the money you're giving him. So that would be a measure of selfishness, and one value his welfare versus your value of the money.
So why would it be selfishness? It would be selfish because it places value in satisfying his desires.
It's your. Well, the question of altruism being selfish looks at weighing two values that you have within yourself. One value is I want him to suffer less. The other value is how much value you're placing on the money you're going to give him in order to obtain that goal. Or, well, if you're saying I'm going to give you this money, I'm being selfish because I want to feel better because you're suffering.
So I'm still satisfying a desire of mine. My desire is that he has a much better life. So however generous I am, give away all my money to this person. It's still egoistic in a sense because it's my desire. Well, I don't really accept that. I think because Schopenhauer doesn't think that to be moral you've got to not satisfy any of your desires. He thinks that it's the question of what the desire aims at. So a moral desire is one that aims purely and simply at the well-being of the other for its own sake. Contrast that with egoistic desire, which aims at my well-being, which I think one point says is morally indifferent. I mean, being egoistic is not always a bad thing. But then there's malicious motivation, where you aim at the harm or the ill of the other for its own sake, not because you gain anything. So, yes, I'm satisfying one of my desires, but he's quite specific that the compassion is a form of willing. It's when the will is motivated in this way, purely and simply by the well-being or woe of the other. So it's a form of action, it's a form of willing, but it takes you a step towards losing the sense of individuality as important. But Taoism, Schopenhauer had, over his career, accumulated a compendious amount of information about studies of Eastern religions. Taoism, I think, is something he doesn't particularly have any contact with. He starts with Vedanta and then later on discovers Buddhism and is very enthusiastic, and in fact even describes himself as a Buddhist in a letter later on in life to his sister. His sister is ill and is probably going to die, and he may not see her before then. And he tries to console her by saying, well, don't think that death really is anything, as we Buddhists would say. Interestingly, he's actually prepared to call himself that. Taoism, I'd have to check back. He has long catalogues of different articles that he's read in English and French and so on from the Asiatic Journal and all sorts of things. And he was quite early on as a Western philosopher and really taking all this very seriously. When he started, there wasn't, I think, a huge amount of literature. By the 1850s, when he's writing, he can write whole bibliographies of stuff that he's read on Eastern religions, Chinese and Indian. Taoism, I don't think he ever uses the term Taoism, as far as I remember. Any of my co-translators can remember better. It's not a pity, but he would probably be sympathetic. What was that?
In reference to how he views romantic love,
Yeah.
do you believe he was influenced by his own failures in his own life in reference to I did some read on it. He had a very successful love life.
He didn't. Well, you wonder which was cause and which was effect. He went into it with this view of what it was.
Also, do you think his pessimistic view of women also impacted his philosophies on love as well?
Yes, I certainly think. I think both of those, and must be an element of both of those in it. But the trouble is, one doesn't like to think that it solely reduces to a kind of personal resentment. But there's definitely, one of his infamous writings on women definitely feed into this, I think. So, as it were, this is the sort of disappointment with women that does affect both of these. Yeah, so I think, but maybe he just wasn't, maybe it's just personality anyway, just didn't suit him very much to love affairs. But he certainly writes, very powerfully about the torment of feeling sexual desire. And Nietzsche, very famously in the genealogy, does a bit of psychoanalysis of him as wanting freedom from the will because he was tormented by his own sexual desire. So maybe right, maybe wrong, but it certainly comes to mind. All the things you said.
Thank you.
So there was somebody else.
A related question, perhaps. Is there any acknowledgement of a qualitative distinction between requited love and unrequited love? The two examples you mentioned, Romeo and Juliet and Werther, yes, both consumed by the passion of it, but very different.
And badly.
Badly in both cases, but Werther's is unrequited love, and Romeo and Juliet, so that they have at least some union, and as do Tristan and Isolde. And this sort of unification and the reciprocity of it seems to suggest a qualitative difference.
Yes, clearly, as with any human undertaking, it can go well or badly. So you can end up, consummating love and finding happiness, but of course, Schopenhauer is very suspicious of that happiness is really anything but an illusion in a general sense. But whether it goes well or badly, it still isn't a good for you. Ultimately, what's happening, according to him, is the species is somehow attaining an end through you. It's trying to. So you might not reproduce as a result, but why? Because he's trying to explain why certain people are attracted to certain other very specific human individuals and not the rest. And he has a whole long list of the sort of characteristics that, rather embarrassingly, the sort of characteristics that he thinks, men are looking for women, women are looking for men. But the whole idea is a kind of eugenic idea that somehow the species is trying to ensure that the next generation is as strong and beautiful and capable as possible, which is, it's not a very nice view in many ways. But it can go well, and you can attain the object of your desire, and experience some pleasure and some happiness. But he does tend to think that once it got to a certain point, it's inevitably disillusioning. There was that passage that we saw that, well, in the end, there's nothing very special about this human being. So there's a kind of, he does think it's ultimately going to be disillusioning, and that may well relate, very frankly, to his own experience. So it's as if, I mean, his view is the species, as it were, wants better offspring. So it deludes you that, having sex with this one person is the thing, this person is the object of ultimate value for you, me to great bliss. That's a delusion, and the delusion falls away, at least eventually, once you attain your object. So it's a pretty jaundiced view. So even if it goes well, even if, as in Walter, he's rejected and commits suicide, that's a possible outcome. But even the successful outcome, from the point of view of the lovers, ultimately doesn't really give them anything that's of value to them. So it is a pretty jaundiced view.
This Becker letter is terrific. What about the relationship between alleviating suffering and promoting well-being? In certain contexts, for certain purposes, might view them as verbal variants of each other. It seems to me that when we really want to say what a moral action is for Schopenhauer, I think a difference is useful. So, if we take the alleviating suffering line, that's what a moral action is, one in which you seek to alleviate another's suffering because he or she is suffering.
Yeah.
So you transcend egoism, and your suffering, don't enter into it, you just see suffering there. Then it seems to me that we can see the transition that puzzles Bernard to the final renunciation on this kind of a model. Schopenhauer thinks that we're sort of all addicted to life.
Sorry, we're all
addicted to life.
addicted to life.
So do I actually help the heroin addict out when I give him heroin? I mean, there he is suffering, he's jonesing, and I give him heroin. Well,